Well, good morning. First of all, let me thank the organizers for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here. What I'm going to talk about today is how social and societal attitudes towards nuclear energy can be affected by outreach and transparency initiatives that are undertaken by states, power authorities, and related entities. And this work comes from a thesis that I undertook for the International School of Nuclear Law at the University of Montpellier. So I fear that with the time limitation, I'll only be able to gloss over some of the case studies that I want to bring to your attention, but I'd be happy to answer more questions throughout the day. As was mentioned in the introductions, combating climate change involves an energy mix that many experts agree must include nuclear. And while technical challenges to nuclear energy exist, for example, the ever-present elephant in the room of waste, high costs, and security concerns, one of the greatest obstacles, in my opinion, is public opinion. So the International Atomic Energy Agency recognizes the need for transparency. Transparency is what I'm going to be arguing for throughout this presentation. The transparency principle, which is outlined above, basically highlights why governments should care about nuclear transparency from a requirements-driven point of view. This presentation will examine how a given set of states comply with the transparency principle, and additionally will ask if transparency helps nuclear endeavors to succeed and thus assist in the smoothness of implementation of these programs. So what does this mean in practical terms? There is the issue of compliance with international legal instruments. We have three main ones: the Aarhus Convention, the Espoo Convention, and the Kiev Protocol. And those basically permit access on the part of the public to the decision-making process and understanding of some of the plans that are ongoing in siting and other nuclear endeavors. But more broadly, I think that what's really important and needs to be undertaken more rigorously in certain realms is to understand the concerns of the public and of the audience, and to engage in outreach before the concerns really come to a head, and to maintain dialogue with the audience and provide information and education. One issue that I'm sure we're all familiar with is encountering a lot of technical jargon in our field, and we can all find that frustrating even as experts in our subfields. So what I think is very important in outreach with the public is that technical knowledge should not be used as a substitute for credibly and comprehensively addressing public concerns. Technical jargon, if communicated, does little to alleviate concerns for a non-technical audience. So to be credible, I think that the language and the attitude must be understandable to the intended public audience. So what I'd like to do now is go through 3 of the 5 case studies that I undertook for my dissertation. Again, these are going to be very brief, so I hope you'll take it with a grain of salt that they don't go into more detail. I'm going to try and look at 3 that are very different, one that shows the success of outreach, one that shows how outreach helped to avoid a problem, and one that shows a failure of outreach and a failure of understanding the public's concerns. So not surprisingly, the case study for high acceptability is the UAE. A 2012 survey indicated that there was an 82% acceptance rate within the UAE for nuclear energy. And furthermore, that 89% of those polled were supportive of having a nuclear power plant in their own emirate, due not only to the need for electricity, but also for desalination, etc. One issue that played, I believe, a great role in this is the public involvement that ENEC undertook. The high level of engagement that was undertaken by Emirates Nuclear Energy Corporation, which included a lot of work in telling the public about progress in nuclear planning. And furthermore, they undertook a lot of work in terms of outlining or acknowledging safety concerns and explaining to the public how safety concerns were going to be addressed. Moving on to the second case study, I'd like to talk briefly about France, which I think is a very, very interesting example. To set the scene, France, from a researcher's point of view, has traditionally had a wide level of acceptance and pride in large-scale technical projects, including nuclear. But there are always exceptions, and the one that I'd like to briefly highlight today occurred in the 1980s. And this was dealing with the issue of nuclear waste siting. And from what I understand from my research, technocrats didn't really consider waste to be a potential public relations nightmare because of the acceptability of these technical projects and nuclear power plants. And so they dug exploratory holes for waste siting in some of the rural regions. What was not expected was that this resulted in extreme unhappiness in those regions, including riots and protests. Communities that had actually wanted nuclear power plants were now fighting against the nuclear waste sites. I believe from my research that this backlash was due not only to the poor communication and transparency involved on the forefront or on the front end, but also due to a lack of any perceived benefits that the rural regions saw for their communities. Additionally, the perception was that this was permanent waste disposal, and that authorities were basically abandoning garbage underneath people's homes. So this concept of permanence was really at the heart of what caused the backlash. One of the politicians who became involved and helped to remedy the situation, Christian Bataille, noted that, to quote him, "The idea of burying waste awoke the most profound of human myths. In France, we bury the dead, we don't bury nuclear waste. This idea of the desecration of the earth was really pivotal in this instance." So what was done to alleviate this, from what I can tell with success, was that they introduced the more palatable notion of reversibility and stocking. So basically what this meant is that there would still be these repositories for waste, but that you could take the material back out for scientific endeavors that might come up in the future. And furthermore, this was palatable because it played into the idea of the scientific endeavor as opposed to simply abandoning waste in someone's home or under someone's home. And following this change in rhetoric and in wording, the regions actually began to apply in order to host some of these labs. So, of course, it's always a good idea to pick on your own country for the negative case study. So I want to use a final example from where I live in Long Island, which is east of New York City. So this is an example of a failed transparency or outreach initiative. And what I specifically want to talk about is not the entire United States, but rather the Shoreham nuclear power plant in Long Island. The building of this plant took place between 1973 and 84. So as you can already imagine, this wasn't really the best time, the best decade and a half or so for nuclear energy. Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island had put fear in people's minds. And in 1983, Suffolk County, where Shoreham is located, the officials there decided that residents would not be able to be safely evacuated in the event of one of these emergencies. And furthermore, the governor at the time issued an order that forbidding state officials from signing any Long Island Lighting Company, LILCO, evacuation plan. The evacuation plans required the community support, so this already was a non-starter since the governor had forbidden this from taking place. And as you can imagine, in 1989, LILCO, the company, agreed not to restart the nuclear power plant. And this was a $6 billion loss that was passed on to Long Island residents through electricity costs and taxes. So some of the really important whys and lessons learned from this, in my opinion, include that at the heart of this was the attitude of LILCO, of the power utility. Executives agreed that it would be, in their words, ludicrous to refuse Shoreham a license based on community opposition. So there was this huge lack of empathy for the fact that there was fear in the community. Furthermore, there was a strain of what I would term technocratic arrogance that contributed to the lack of public acceptance and the failure of the project. I would love to talk about this much longer, but in the interest of time, let me just wrap up and say that my advice to get nuclear endeavors such as this to be more understood and more acceptable to the broader audience would be to undertake transparency and outreach. Those things yield results. Reach out to critics and maintain this dialogue and don't go into it with any sort of opacity. And to keep community members apprised and involved in what's going on. And furthermore, as a cultural anthropologist, I do think, especially in the France example, that you can understand how being tapped into the cultural norms and attitudes of the population can be greatly beneficial. Thank you.
Thank you, Katherine. That was an excellent presentation, and I really appreciate you keeping to time. We've had a lot of experiences with the issues around stakeholder engagement in the UK, particularly around the siting of waste here as well, so we're a waste repository. So it's a very hot topic here as well. We do need to move forward quickly. So next we have Shashi van der Graaff, who is a PhD candidate at the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland, Australia. She is examining historical and contemporary developments in civil nuclear programs. Shashi has published research on nuclear energy policy, corporate social responsibility, and disaster management. She is also a convener of the Political Studies Association Environmental Politics Specialist Group. Please welcome her to the stand.
Hello, thank you very much for the opportunity to present here today. Thank you to Rusi, and it's great to see so much interest in civil as well as military nuclear power. I'll begin by apologising. I am Australian, so I tend to talk very loudly and very quickly, and that's probably going to become amplified given the short time frame that we have today and my desire to throw as much information at you as I possibly can in 10 minutes. I will also just give a quick disclaimer. This is drawn from my PhD research. I'd like to qualify that this is not meant to be a presentation that is anti-nuclear. It sometimes has been interpreted as such, but that is not the intention that I'm going for. So, my PhD research broadly looks at historical and contemporary changes in civil nuclear energy development, but more specifically I look at the disconnection between the expectation and reality of the nuclear renaissance and what's happened particularly in the regions of Western Europe and North America. I investigate this topic from a social science perspective using social science research frameworks and methodologies, which tries to give a new perspective on the issue. So the purpose of today's presentation is twofold. I'm going to very briefly evidence the disjuncture that does exist between the rhetoric and reality of the nuclear renaissance, and in doing so I also hope to highlight the need for further research into this topic from a broader range of theoretical and disciplinary perspectives. So as a very broad structure, we're going to evidence the rhetoric of the nuclear renaissance, compare this to the reality of civil nuclear new build from 2000 onwards, and then ask some questions about how we can explain this disjuncture. So let's begin. Starting in around 2000, we saw a very large number of journalists, academics, industry representatives, and political leaders make public statements predicting an imminent revival or renaissance of nuclear power. There was an expectation that the stagnation and decline that had afflicted many of the world's longest-standing nuclear industries would be suddenly reinvigorated, and we would be seeing a much bigger number of nuclear new build taking place. This expectation came to be shared by many political leaders worldwide who made public statements in support of nuclear power with a level of enthusiasm that we hadn't seen for several decades. But in terms of all the rhetoric about a nuclear renaissance that took place during this time, while the phrase became very ubiquitous, it was not very often actually defined as to what exactly people meant when they were talking about a nuclear renaissance. So through my research, I have tried to identify some key principles that really underpin what this expectation was meant to be about. I've identified two principles. The first is that there was meant to be a substantial growth in the number of new nuclear reactors being constructed. But the second principle is one which I think is a little bit more overlooked in the nuclear debate, which is that much of this growth was meant to take place in some of the longest-standing nuclear industries. And this is really where the idea of a renaissance or revival of nuclear power stems from. It was not just the expectation that nuclear new build would be taking place in first time in nuclear countries, but instead that some of the industries that had driven the early growth in the 1950s and 1960s, which were primarily located in the regions of Western Europe and North America, would experience a massive reinvigoration of their nuclear industries. So this chart just briefly shows the global nuclear reactor construction starts from 1970 to the late 1990s worldwide. As we can see, there has been quite a clear trend of decline, and so when the talk of a nuclear renaissance emerged in the early 2000s and gained momentum then, it really did represent a significant shift in the political agenda on nuclear power. Why did all the talk emerge? Well, there's a combination of factors which essentially created a much more favourable political environment for nuclear power, a few of the key reasons being the growth of climate change as a policy problem and the reframing of nuclear power as a low-carbon energy solution to address this, growing concerns around energy security and a need to be less reliant on foreign imports of fossil fuels, and improvements in nuclear reactor technologies and designs which were meant to be cheaper, safer, more efficient than ever before. But to what extent did this rhetoric of a nuclear renaissance actually turn into a reality? Well, we know that there have been a substantial number of new reactor construction starts in China and Russia, and to a lesser extent in India, South Korea, and the United States, as well as very small numbers elsewhere. But if we look at a regional breakdown of nuclear new build from 2000 onwards, we start to see quite a different picture to what the rhetoric of a nuclear renaissance suggested. In particular, we see quite a significant lack of a nuclear renaissance taking place in Western Europe and North America. Again, this is surprising given that these were the regions where political rhetoric was the strongest, and these were the regions where really the idea of a revival of nuclear power was meant to stem from. So this chart shows a regional breakdown of nuclear power reactors under construction from 1954 until 2014. A few key points to draw your attention to. So from the mid-1950s to the mid-1970s, we see quite a significant growth in nuclear reactors under construction, and this was driven mainly by the nice green and yellow areas, which are Western Europe and North America. We then see a sustained decline from the mid-1970s until the mid-2000s, at which point we do in fact see some revival of nuclear power taking place. But the regional breakdown that's occurred during the Renaissance period is quite different from the regional breakdown that occurred during the early period of expansion. We can see that the growth that has taken place from the mid-2000s onwards has been located primarily in the regions of Asia and Central and Eastern Europe, and these figures are also skewed further by the high number of reactor construction starts that we're seeing taking place in China and Russia. So hopefully what you can take away from this chart is that from the mid-2000s onwards, when we were meant to be starting to see evidence of a nuclear renaissance taking place, there has been very little growth taking place in Western Europe and North America. And also in terms of the overall number of reactor construction starts taking place during the Renaissance period, it has not yet come anywhere close to the early period of expansion in the 60s and early 70s. Similarly, in terms of the number of nuclear reactors in operation worldwide, we can see that this is largely flatlined from about the mid-1980s onwards. And while there has been some amount of increase in the net electrical capacity of nuclear power, these figures still aren't really reflecting the large amount of enthusiasm that we saw taking place around the expectation of a renaissance. I'm not going to go through this wall of text, but it is just meant to lend further evidence to the argument that we have not seen the rhetoric becoming a reality in the way that was suggested. A few key points to draw your attention to. We have seen several examples of reactor construction projects being suspended or delayed or abandoned throughout the globe from the mid-2000s onwards, and also that much of the increase in global nuclear generation that has occurred from 2000 onwards has been largely due to technical alterations, productivity improvements, and lifetime extensions at existing nuclear power plants, rather than as a result of new nuclear reactors entering operation. We also see the conclusions of several high-profile industry and energy reports making similar conclusions about the apparent failure or death of the nuclear renaissance, again, primarily in the regions of Western Europe and North America. Which brings us all nicely back to the core question of this presentation. Why has the expectation of a nuclear renaissance failed to produce widespread nuclear growth in Western Europe and North America? Two common explanations have commonly been put forward to answer this question. The first is cost, that nuclear reactors are simply too expensive to construct, too financially risky, and as a result we have not seen a true revival of nuclear power. The Renaissance reactors that are under construction in Finland, France, and the attempts to construct Hinkley Point C in the UK are often cited as evidence of this argument. The second argument that's commonly put forward is that the Fukushima nuclear disaster in March 2011 reignited public and political concerns over nuclear safety. This has made politicians less willing to support nuclear new build as they are wary of a potential voter backlash. However, in my opinion, neither of these explanations on their own can explain the disjunction between the rhetoric and reality. The events at Fukushima failed to explain why we saw so little evidence of real growth towards a nuclear renaissance prior to 2011, and the global implications of these two arguments means that they alone are not sufficient to explain the regional differences in nuclear energy development since 2000. So through my PhD research, I try to find an alternative explanation for this disjuncture. In doing so, I argue that existing explanations for the absence of a nuclear renaissance have tended to focus on factors specific to the construction, operation, and maintenance of nuclear power plants, primarily those issues that were mentioned earlier around cost, safety concerns, and nuclear waste. I argue that while these are absolutely important factors to explaining the reality of civil nuclear new build, they alone cannot explain the regional and country-based differences that we can see. So I adopt instead a social science perspective to try and present an alternative view and to draw attention to a broader range of social, political, cultural and contextual factors that can help to create a more comprehensive explanation for the disjuncture. Because I'm massively running out of time, I'm just going to leave these up here. These are just some of the factors which, through my research, I highlight, and if you have questions about them, you can feel free to ask me later or catch me at the lunch break. But I think I will probably have to just about leave it there. So hopefully what you've taken away from this presentation is that further research is needed to examine the disjuncture between the rhetoric and reality of the nuclear renaissance, and that this needs to be undertaken from a broader range of disciplinary and theoretical perspectives. Thank you.
Wow, we have a real sense of pressure here, I think. Thanks so much, Shashi. That's really interesting insight and thoughts there on why reality has not met rhetoric. Without further ado, we will invite Antony Mcgrath to the stand. He is a controls engineer at Rolls-Royce Submarines. He has a degree in electrical and electronic engineering, and in 2010 he joined the Nuclear Graduates Program and gained experience in high-hazard decommissioning, commercial projects and power generation, working at Sellafield, the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, and EDF Energy. He is the Vice Chair of the nuclear industry in the UK's Young Generation Network and is currently working towards achieving chartership. He is going to take us once more into the Valley of Death.
Hopefully not. So, good morning. As Miranda said, my name is Antony Mcgrath, and I'm an engineer at Rolls-Royce and Vice Chair of the Nuclear Institute's Young Generation Network. Firstly, I'd like to thank the UKPONI team for affording me the opportunity to speak here today, and to my colleagues, both past and present, for helping me formulate the views I'm about to present. On that note, I would like to stress that the views and thoughts you're about to hear today are that of my own and not of that of my employer or any organisation or institute that I represent. So today we're going to talk about the UK's nuclear aspirations and pose the question, are we trundling once more into the Valley of Death? So let's take a trip down memory lane. The UK has a very rich heritage when it comes to nuclear energy. So for example, in the top left we've got the Sellafield site, a site where nuclear technology was pioneered. In that picture alone you can see Magnox reactors, the demonstration AGO reactor, 2 fuel reprocessing streams, a national lab, waste processing plants, decommissioning projects, and much, much more. Top right, we've got Dounreay, a place where since the 1950s, fast breeder technology has been pioneered. The bottom left, UK industry has been designing, manufacturing, and supporting the Royal Navy's nuclear submarines for over 50 years. And at the bottom right, Sizewell B, representing a long history of nuclear power generation in the UK. And of course, these are just a few examples, missing out others such as fuel enrichment, strategic weapons, fuel manufacture, and fusion R&D. But unfortunately, a rich heritage doesn't always guarantee a bright future. And unfortunately, in some cases, that's all it is, a heritage. In 2011, the House of Lords Select Committee on Science and Technology investigated whether the government was doing enough to maintain the advanced nuclear R&D skills that the UK required in order to ensure nuclear energy to remain a viable option for the UK. Their conclusion, which from the Graaff probably will come to surprise you, was that they weren't doing enough. Their findings, which I'm calling the first valley of death, were quite astounding. So in the 1980s, you can see there was over 8,000 personnel in the industry engaged in nuclear R&D, and this is backed by government funding of over £300 million. And throughout the 80s and 90s, through privatisation in some sectors of UK nuclear industry, we lost our capability. It really deteriorated. The UK's nuclear capability, R&D capability, began to focus on things that actually we really needed, so maintaining the existing fleet and on legacy waste. And whilst I welcome the focus on legacy waste, something that we really need to deal with, I would argue that the decisions that led to the deterioration of our capability were not the right ones and contributed significantly towards the challenges that we are facing today. So the government responded, and in true government style, it was a little later than planned, in March 2013. And one of the ways they responded was through the publication of the UK's Nuclear Future, our nuclear industrial strategy. It states its vision: together, government and industry have a clear and ambitious vision to ensure the development of a vibrant UK nuclear industry that is an area of economic and strategic national strength, providing the UK with a safe, reliable and affordable supply of low-carbon electricity. Fantastic vision, nice words. It sets out a lot of actions, including increasing funding in the area of R&D and skills, and it provides indicative milestones. And whilst I'm aware and have been involved in some of the great work as a result of this strategy, 3 years after its publication, we still don't have a vision of what the nuclear industry is going to look like in the 2050. So let's take a look at the headlines as they are today. And this isn't from a newspaper, this is just my own headlines, the Antony Mcgrath Chronicle. So the UK nuclear new build programme delayed again. So as of today we have no nuclear new build programme in the UK. We have an aspirational programme, but we've got no nuclear new build programme. 3 years after the publication of the industrial strategy, 10 years after the government decided to put its backing into nuclear new build, not a single brick has been laid. So we're also reliant on foreign investment in order to build these programmes. One very important point to note is our most visible programme in the UK for nuclear new build hasn't even started yet. It's behind schedule. The costs are ever growing. So how is that affecting our public image and our recruitment? Which leads nicely onto my second point. We are facing substantial challenges in the areas of skills and capability. All sectors of the UK nuclear industry are reliant upon each other. We're simply too small to go it alone. Recruitment, skills, and capability sustainment rely upon a successful industry. The top talent isn't going to join an industry that's failing. So given the scarcity of these skills and the requirement that other programmes have, such as Crossrail, we really need to be getting our act together, but we've known about this problem for years. And we've no clear focus for what the nuclear industry is doing in the UK. I feel the government and the supply chain are distracted by Hinkley Point C. So how can we really consider the long term when we can't get our near-term programmes off the ground? Well, for the future of industry, we must. So let's consider it. What you see here is an indicative technical scale and timescales of our current programmes. So the most advanced technical programmes towards the top. So these are programmes that we're on with today. Not everything is represented here. So I'm going to outline some of the key decisions that I feel need made in sort of this time period here in order to ensure a successful, prosperous nuclear industry. So the UK wants to be a global leader in innovative nuclear technology. In order to do that, we must take on the really technical, advanced technical stuff. So we need to be in this green dotted area. And if we're going to be a global leader in nuclear technology, then we're going to want to export our technology. So let's start with that as the target. But before we do that, we need to get the basics right. So we need to make a decision on GDF. There is work ongoing in this area, and we're learning from our European partners, but we really need to pursue this programme and get it off the ground. Also, we need to make a decision on how long won. What is the UK doing? UK industry is interested. The public's interested. Will the ONR need ONR need to carry out another generic design assessment? Well, they'll need to know because they'll need to resource it because they're quite resource intensive. So let's make a decision. Also, what about beyond 16 gigawatt? So in order to meet our legally binding 2050 greenhouse gas commitments, we need between 20 and 38 gigawatts of nuclear power. In that region, reprocessing becomes commercially viable, but we're closing down our 2 reprocessing streams in the UK by 2022 at the latest. So how are we going to maintain that capability? Well, let's make a decision today. And what are we going to do with plutonium management? The UK has the largest civil plutonium stockpile in the world. It's not a waste, it's an asset. So let's stop putting off the decision and make a decision today on what we're going to do with it. Also, what's the future of defence look like? We've just spent a huge amount of effort getting the astute and successful programmes off the ground. Let's not sacrifice that capability or lose it by indecisions and pushing the decision out to the right. What about future technology, potentially UK development, and other decisions such as the Gen 4, Gen 5, thorium, fusion? Well, we're simply not big enough to do all these programs, so let's provide some focus on what we are actually going to do, which they might lead us into technology export. But the one where I feel that we need to spend the most attention is the development of small modular reactors. That is probably the key point and where the UK is best placed to develop. And while the recent government announcement of 250 million in advanced R&D, which they intend to select the best design for SMRs, it should be welcomed. Are we showing up to the party a little bit late? Because we're not the only ones looking at SMRs. There's plenty of other countries around the world. The USA, France, Russia, China and South Korea have a combined 39 plants under construction currently, and a further 241 planned or proposed, primarily in Russia or China. The respective governments of these countries are providing significant support, both financial and resource, to their nuclear industries. For example, the US Department of Energy announced over 300 million to support the development and licensing of small modular reactors. Their 2016 budget included over 600 million to support US civil R&D and over £9 billion in loan guarantees to support advanced nuclear projects. £9 billion, that alone is nearly 10 times the budget of the UK's Department of Energy and Climate Change. Can the UK really compete? I think yes, it can. The UK is very innovative, but we need clear government policy, and we need clear government backing, and we need a lot more investment. And if it doesn't happen soon, we might find ourselves once more entering the valley of death. So it won't be easy. They're very difficult decisions to make, and as I said, it's a huge investment at a time of austerity. So the decisions may get pushed to the right, or we may fail altogether. What happens if the decisions aren't made? Well, we're going to end up in the area that we don't want to be, where the technical challenge is low, and really anyone can do it. The UK won't be a global leader in nuclear technology anymore. We will have squandered the significant investment we're making in the area of skills. It will be difficult to maintain or sustain the current programs that we have, or they'll simply become more expensive. We will lose any potential for growth in the UK, and we'll become reliant, even more reliant, on foreign technology. We could recover from this again, however, it'll be very expensive, it'll be very slow and unpalatable. But, on a positive note, as of today, we haven't failed. There is still time to make positive, decisive actions. And on that slightly more positive note, I'd like to conclude. We have a rich heritage, but today the headlines aren't that great. We're operating in a global nuclear marketplace, so if we don't do it, others will, so we can't delay. A bright nuclear future is within our grasp, but we've got two options. We can allow the sun to set on the possibility of a prosperous nuclear industry, or we can take positive, decisive actions now and this can be the dawning of a bright nuclear future for the UK. Thank you.